So we are on part 3 of a 6-part series on how to stay in conversation about racism. Today's topic is about listening meaningfully and wholeheartedly. As always, we have our talk bookended with a couple of important points. The first one is that we'd like to acknowledge that we are located on the traditional territories of the Arapaho, Cheyenne, and Ute nations. And just in case you didn't know, there are 48 contemporary tribal nations that are historically tied to the lands that make up the state of Colorado. I myself love to use this part of the presentation to acknowledge my own ancestors of the Choctaw Nation and the Coushatta Nation, Mitakuye Oyasin, to all my relations. We would also like to offer you our pledge. I and we will be encouraging and humorous in our offerings. I will explain thoughtfully and clearly. I will offer citation for what I have learned and concede openly what I have not yet learned. I will ensure a welcoming, judgment-free, and inviting environment where counterpoint ideas can be exchanged diplomatically. Our discussion will welcome new ideas and perspectives, and I will remain receptive to these concepts changing and transforming based on your feedback. Please let me know if you perceive glaring holes in my research. That's about intellectual humility at the academic level. I intend to give you tools to increase your conversancy, expand your boundaries, and nurture independence. I have no interest in telling you what to think, but I am passionate about helping you to ask better questions so the world can reveal its many truths to you without interference from socially indoctrinated filters. We will respect your differences and our differences in and out of the classroom on Zoom. Your dignity and comfort are important to us, and in return, we ask for courage, diplomacy, open thinking, and active involvement. We have many chat opportunities to interact with you and a Q&A at the end. We hold ourselves accountable to the same caliber and standards we are requesting of you. The final bookmark that we will always start this series with is this wonderful quote by Haim Junot. As a teacher, I possess tremendous power to make a child's life miserable or joyous. I can be a tool of torture or an instrument of inspiration. I can humiliate or humor, hurt or heal. In all cases, it is my response that decides whether a situation will be escalated or de-escalated, or a child humanized or dehumanized. We ask you to screenshot that quote, put it somewhere beautiful that will help remind you at all times that you are located in a place of being a change maker, regardless of whether you are a leader on campus, a staff member on campus, a service member on campus, a mentor on campus. You are always in the position of being a change maker based on your response to a situation. Today's topic of listening meaningfully and wholeheartedly. I'm going to pass it to Kirsi.
So we'd like to start with a little chat. We want to know how you feel when someone truly listens to you with sincerity and fullness. How do you respond? So if you could just put in the chat how you feel, how do you respond to that? What are you thinking when someone is really listening to you in that way? Okay, I see heard, grateful, affirmed, respected, relieved, comforted, fully seen and honored. I feel loved. I feel respected and heard. I feel validated and eager to continue. I feel genuinely connected to another human, acknowledged and respected, grounded, safe, accepted, and I belong. I may not have seen all of them as they rushed past me. Thank you so much for sharing. Yes, this is exactly why we are talking about how we can better listen. And in my previous career, I was a psychotherapist, and my experience there was that most people think that they do listen well, even though most people also know that in many cases they are not listened to very well. So obviously those two pieces of information don't match. I want to share a little bit of research that comes from the Listening Center in Palo Alto. And that research indicates that we spend about 80% of our waking hours communicating, 9% writing, 16% reading, maybe that's a little higher in academia, 30% speaking, and about 40 to 45% of our day engaged in listening to people, music, TV, radio, etc. And about 75% of that time, we are forgetful, preoccupied, or not paying attention. The average attention span for an adult in the United States, they have determined is about 22 seconds, which incidentally is why most commercials are about 15 to 30 seconds. And when we are learning, for example, in this webinar today, when we walk away from our learning experience, a few hours later, we only retain about 10 to 20% of what we have heard. That's pretty sobering, especially for people who are presenting, but also if you think about having had a difficult conversation with someone, what is the likelihood that the two of you or the group of you go your separate ways and have very different impressions of what just occurred?
Exactly. And so part of standing against racism is very much about, instead of trying to configure arguments, really finding a way to listen as meaningfully as possible. And in putting together this week's presentation, we wanted to address something that we feel accountable for. In this week's topic and in the presentation, we are citing many European American authors who themselves are anti-racist in their writings and their efforts, but we are fully aware of this publishing bias in the industrialized and very white-dominated power structures of the United States. So the body of lived experiences and strategies, scholarship, and the cultural knowledge from authors and scholars and activists of color are included in the resources for this webinar. And so specifically, if you go to donnainthedance.com, there's a resource tab that lists pages and pages of materials from authors of color. But specifically in today's presentation, to keep it short, we selected just a few folks that we wish to highlight to you. So thank you for joining us. The first thing to consider in a listening situation is what are the assumed power dynamics between parties. In true anti-bias and diplomacy work, we seek to understand those power differentials in every single circumstance with the unique people that are involved. We also seek to move away from a binary of absolutes and, strangely, notions of right and wrong. Anti-bias work also acknowledges the hidden and implicit bias that impacts our perceptions and subconscious stories about the world around us. And then with this, we have to be aware that those subconscious biases work at all times. The Southern Poverty Law Center clarifies the difference between prejudice and racism in this following way. We are all prejudiced somehow. We organize input from our world and create clusters and categories of information to try to understand our world. This is part of what the human brain does naturally. Racism, though, is a unilateral and categorical display of bias against a group, a devaluation of a group that is categorically applied regardless of who the individuals are in front of you. So hopefully that helps you to understand that, yes, we all have biases. Admitting them and admitting that they sometimes come into play is not a failure. It is a beautiful honesty that we encourage. So assuming that you may harbor some of these fragilities and biases and thinking errors, I wanted to offer this quote from Dr. Robin DiAngelo. White fragility is a state in which even a minimum amount of racial stress becomes intolerable, triggering a range of defensive moves. These moves include the outward display of emotions such as anger, fear, guilt, and behaviors such as argumentation, silence, and leaving the stress-inducing situation. These behaviors, in turn, function to reinstate white racial equilibrium. Racial stress results from an interruption to what is racially familiar. So fragility and biases have a tendency to unseat us the moment we feel that we're moving into territory that is unfamiliar to us, things that make us feel discomfort in a very real way.
We are revisiting here the work of Dr. Harriet Lerner because we feel it's important and it bears looking at again. What Dr. Harriet Lerner says about defensiveness, number one, is that it's natural. We all do it when we are challenged, and it's on any topic. And also that it's very very important to develop strategies on how to minimize our own defensiveness, because the only way forward in human relationships is truly listening to another. We are generally very unaware when we ourselves become defensive. It's interesting because we become hyper-aware when our counterparts become defensive. Dr. Lerner suggests a strategy for how to detect your own defensiveness, and that is when you notice that you are listening only to find exaggerations, mischaracterizations, and errors. In other words, you're listening for what you disagree with. That is when you are already in defensive mode. And that is a good clue to step back and try to broaden your sense of what you're listening for. Remind yourself of what your goal is in terms of wanting to understand what the other person is coming from, and not launching in with a rebuttal once that person has finished their narrative.
In emphasizing to you that this workshop is about listening, we also want to acknowledge, very importantly, that you may at times have the strong possibility of dealing with someone who seems to be a danger to you or themselves. And under those circumstances, we would want to emphasize that it's time to reach out and ask for help rather than always trying to say, I'm going to be a good ambassador and I'm going to stay present and I'm going to make sure I listen carefully. Sometimes that is not exactly what's best for you. So the fine line in the sand between someone who is a danger to you or someone who is simply making you uncomfortable has been detailed by ELLIS AMDUR. ELLIS AMDUR is a crisis intervention trainer and also an AIKIDO practitioner. He states, beyond aggression, you may observe an immaturity or cognitive impairment and anger, and people who display such patterns of behavior have a more difficult time getting help, both in expressing their needs and taking in information when it is offered. This can be frustrating for both of you. When you can recognize the pattern of communication that such people display, as well as understand how to best get through to them, you have a greater opportunity to respond to them in an ethical and caring manner. So our goal today is to say, how do you increase your diplomacy training as a listener? Ultimately, when people are emotionally immature, they may fail to take responsibility. They may not feel remorse. They may lack empathy. They may lack a conscience possessing full reasoning capacity. They may suffer from substance interference. They may be developmentally impacted or delayed. They may lack development of their higher metacognition. So within those that have more severe disorders of moral reasoning, their concern doesn't extend beyond what is good or bad for them and only them. And if you are with someone that is a danger in that way, it's time to end the conversation and get help.
And I want to underline what Donna is saying, in that we are not recommending that you engage with people who are either emotionally damaging to you or physically dangerous to you. That's not where we're going. If someone is verbally attacking you, and what I mean by that is name calling or showing signs of physical aggression, sometimes you can get the sense of that as that they're picking up things like furniture and they're about to throw them. You need to disengage at that point. It's not safe. And if you care about the relationship, you can always offer to reconvene later. But it's not wise to stay in that circumstance at that time. That other person is losing control.
If you do desire to remain present and you feel safe doing so, we're going to move into tips about how to develop deep listening. Deep listening on the left side of your screen is really a combination of a few things. It's earnest communication and a sense of investment. It's also about your attention span, your ability to remain present with whomever you're speaking with. It's also about being able to master your emotions to the point of being able to comprehend clearly what is being said without layering in other interpretations and meanings. And your own tracking and memory of what's occurring. So as you can understand, that's a big task list to work with while you are trying to do some deep listening. The tips on the right side of your screen deal mostly with one-by-one skill sets that can help. Number one, practice focusing on your breath to slow down and de-escalate yourself. In previous workshops, you've heard us talk about the importance of the exhalation. The exhalation is important because when you are in a heightened state, a fearful state, you tend to inhale more oxygen so that your muscles will be energized for action and you can mobilize quickly if there's a threat or you need to flee. When you exhale, you're telling the brain that there is no real threat and it does not have to dump loads of neurotransmitters into your system and to heighten the panic, that there is a calm place for your brain to start cultivating. You also want to dimensionalize your understanding beyond a single perspective or narrative. This means researching versus reacting, going into research mode. So when we say dimensionalize your understanding, it's very much about saying, okay, I've got this vantage point on this issue, but if I listen carefully, I'm going to start to hear another vantage point. And then I'd like to seek more information. And the more vantage points I can gain on this issue, the more clarity I will have in my understanding. So that's where we say research versus react. As always, model respectful behavior. If you're rolling your eyes and if you're looking exasperated and uninterested, that communication to whomever you're listening to will start to impact the effectiveness of the interaction. Summarize and seek confirmation of understanding. You can always say, may I pause on what you just said? Am I understanding this correctly? And staying open to feedback, even if it is delivered in less than ideal ways. Isn't that tough to do? It is so tough to stay present when you feel that perhaps there are some veiled insults, there are distortions being hurled at you, and trying to say, what 5% of realness and truth in here can I attend to, even if the rest of it feels like it's hurtful?
Yeah, and I want to second what Donna is saying in that it is very difficult to do. However, the more you practice, it's just like building a muscle, the better you get at it. And so we'd like to start this next discussion about really exploring our awareness about what are we doing now. So please chat me when you're not at your best, because we're really trying to get at a baseline. All of us have a baseline, and I don't think any of us have a highly adaptive baseline. I don't know that I've ever met anyone whose knee-jerk reactions are highly adaptive. So when you're at your worst, what is your knee-jerk reaction if someone brings to you a difficult conversation, especially around race? So what is your knee jerk? How do you tend to respond when you're tired, you're hungry, you're just overloaded, when someone's
Depleted.
bringing something difficult to you about yourself? Withdraw, shut it out, freeze. I can be defensive, shut down, annoyed, defensive, avoidance, annoyed, yeah. Distancing, excellent. Lashing out, try to be reactive instead of responsive, or tend to be, excuse me, passive aggressive, apologize without deeply thinking about the concern or feeling hurt. Thank you for being so transparent with us, and for, being aware of your knee jerk. I think it's always good to be aware of your underlying tendency of where you go, because every time you're in a place where you're just not, it's not a good day, you're not at your best, knowing that that is your tendency will then help you counteract it. Okay. So for example, I tend to shut down, and knowing that, I have developed little prompts for myself that allow me to stay engaged. So things like phrases in my head like, tell me more. I don't think I'm understanding very well. I want to understand your perspective and I'm not sure I'm understanding. So little prompts that I can use in those moments to re-engage, because I know I tend to shut down.
The slide in front of you will be a repeat slide that you may have seen in our first presentation in the series. We wanted to revisit it because, again, we're going deeper on these issues. So when you are the recipient of a courageous or a very difficult conversation, and especially if someone is not in their best behavior, here are some things that you can say. Thank you for approaching me. The information you are presenting is unsettling and difficult for me, but I want you to know that I'm interested in understanding what you are offering. I pledge to take a break when I feel the urge to be hurtful in this conversation. Could I ask you to please be patient with me if I need to momentarily calm myself down? Or you can say, I want to hear you fully and be thoughtful in my response. Would you be willing to meet with me again after I've had a chance to think meaningfully about it? One more option. I hear you and wish to sincerely consider this feedback. May I ask you a few questions to help me situate this information better in my understanding? These are just ways to get unstuck if you feel that flight, fight, freeze things starting to scramble your brain. Just getting yourself unstuck with a question is a wonderful way to restart diplomacy in a situation and bring civility back. There are ways to actually practice getting better at listening, because so many people will practice presenting, practice singing, but what about practicing listening? I wanted to give you some information from a few wonderful resources, starting with the Listening Center and their teacher, Kay Lindall, from this center in Long Beach, California. Kirsi, would you like to take this one?
So when you prepare to listen, try to slow yourself down, cultivate silence, and become present. Some people use the practice of meditation to practice this. That's an effective way to do that, not the only way. Listen to yourself, ask yourself, what wants to be said next? That's a beautiful question. Pay attention to the environment. Stop what you are doing to listen. Turn off background noise when possible. If you're in the middle of a coffee shop and there's hubbub all around you, that may not be the best place to engage in a conversation that's deep and about serious matters. Cultivate empathy. Put your agenda aside for the moment and put yourself in their shoes. There are various practices to do this, but the technique I mentioned earlier, Harriet Lerner's technique about stopping yourself from just listening for what you disagree with, will help you move towards empathy. Suspend assumptions, judgments, evaluations, titles, and status. One way to think about this is that, you know, you're putting on your researcher hat and you are collecting data and distancing yourself emotionally from the content and trying to evaluate it with a little bit less of a reactive response. Respect and honor differences. Listen for understanding, not to agree with or believe what is being said. I think this is very critical. Most of us, when we're listening, we think if we don't, or we act as if, I don't know that we really think this, but we act as if we don't object immediately in the moment, then we agree to everything the other person said. That's not the case, and you can reserve the time on another occasion or later in the conversation to say, I disagree. Asking, is there anything else, when the person stops speaking? I think this is an absolutely critical skill, because most people stop speaking before they've told you everything. And it is a moment that's testing whether you really want to hear what they have to say or not. And so when you ask the question, is there anything else? Was there something else you wanted to share with me? There's a variety of ways of doing that. Harriet Lerner does cover a number of different prompts in her book, Why Won't You Apologize? But that lets the other person know that you really want to know. You really want to hear more. And often you will hear quite a bit more at that point.
Another author that gives some good practice techniques for listening is Douglas E. Noll, who's the co-founder of Prison of Peace. And he works in maximum security prisons with violent offenders, teaching them how to minimize fight culture amongst themselves. He points out that allowing people to be heard in a profoundly deep way creates space for a new civility. And he says, in order to practice those very tense moments of exchange, listen to commercials. Now, I can't believe that I'm actually telling you to listen to a commercial. But he says, tune out the words for a moment. Don't listen to the content, listen to the emotion in the actors' voices for the commercial. And within a 20-second span of a commercial, you'll notice anxiety, fear, embarrassment, hope, and relief, some type of resolution that their product or service will give you. And just by practicing listening to emotions, it helps you in a moment where you feel overwhelmed by what someone is saying to you. You can start to affect label, start to say, this person is angry, this person is hurt, this person feels abandoned, and get to the underlying issues behind sometimes the hurtful words that are being offered. He also suggests that practice waiting. We have so many opportunities to do this. I can be at the grocery store and I'm annoyed at what's happening in front of me, but instead of indulging annoyance, I simply practice waiting attentively, being watchful, being observant, and really trying to stay present in the moment. And if we don't practice that, then we never build our stamina for it. He also emphasizes that we have so much emphasis on the verbal landscape. And if you feel that words are not coming to you in a situation, let your imagination fire up. Allow metaphors and images to arise in your mind if words don't organize on their own. And that just taking a moment to let those images and sensations and metaphors rise up is the process of coming out of pre-verbal and moving into the land of verbal precision. Yeah. So give it a chance to work.
So let's go, if we can go back to the previous slide, Donna. We would like to have you chat to us. Which of these strategies that we covered most appeals to you? So I'm going to give you a moment to look at this slide, and then I'm going to ask Donna to go to the previous slide where we shared other strategies for practicing listening. Okay, practice waiting is one that comes up. Yep, we're very impatient in our culture. And Donna, can you go to the previous slide? Love the idea of allowing metaphors and images to arise, especially as an introvert. Okay, hang on, I lost where I was. Practice of waiting attentively, something I need to work on. I like the commercials exercise for a quick exercise. Yes to metaphors. Listen for understanding, practice waiting. I love the idea of practice, especially practicing waiting with presence. Attentive waiting, lovely. The imagination strategy is a great idea. I love practicing waiting to cultivate patience. I like the is there anything else question. Listen for understanding, not necessarily agreement or denial. Listen, I think we all need to practice more empathy. Okay, missing one here. Asking questions is helpful. Listening to understand, practicing waiting, very hard to do, yes. So I think what's very interesting to me, hearing your comments, is that you're affirming that listening is difficult. It's hard to do it well. And I appreciate that, because having that awareness is the first step to really being able to do it well. So thank you, Donna. Go ahead and, oh, hang on. We have a couple more comments. Let's see. So cultivating patience, particularly hard for them when people say things like the pandemic is a hoax or racism doesn't exist. Asking myself what needs to be said next. There's a question, is trying to identify underlying emotions in contradiction to suspending assumptions or evaluations? That's an excellent question. Mm-hmm. Do you want to take that now, or do you want to answer it in the Q&A section of our talk?
I'm going to bounce that to Q&A without wanting to be hurtful, only because some of the additional content we're going to cover might help with that line in the sand. But I want to make sure we don't lose that. Excellent point. So we wanted to revisit that there may be times where listening is ineffective, and to recognize that within yourself. So for example, you sincerely may not have time at that moment. I remember how many times I was trying not to be late picking up my child from school because I was in a work situation that I didn't want to be insensitive to and shut down. But I had to at some point to say, I have to go pick up my daughter, right? Every parent knows that vibe. When you recognize that you have a short fuse at that moment and you feel unable to be objective or sincere, you feel unreasonably imposed upon. I recall being at a performance Q&A after doing a gala performance. I was in the front lobby of the theater, meeting and greeting clients and patrons from the show, and there was a woman who was intently asking me questions, and all of a sudden I felt cold air on my backside. And it turns out someone wanted to see the embroidery on the hem of my costume and had lifted up the skirt hem to look at the embroidery and exposed my backside to the entire hall. And that was one of those moments where I felt unreasonably imposed upon, just objectified. And I smacked down my skirt and turned around ready to just lash out at the person who had exposed me, and realized that it was a young woman with some cognitive and developmental impairment who was simply enamored with what she saw. And had I not been able to hit the pause button, I would have unleashed my fury on someone who didn't deserve it and really had good intentions. So again, getting into the question that was just asked, how to look at underlying motivations and at the same time assess when you're in a good space to receive what's happening. That's one example I'd like to offer. What if another person refuses to calm down and resorts to insults and vengeance and hostilities even after you've made yourself available to listen? That's when you start to perhaps feel like a doormat. And if you feel that you can keep your sense of humor in that moment, I say cheers to you. That is a powerful medicine to walk through the world with. If you feel you've lost your sense of humor and it's really starting to invade you, it's time to hit the pause button and say, I'm not available to visit right now. We have to reschedule this if you'd like to continue, and here are the ground rules for engagement. What if you assess your physical safety is at risk and another person intends actual harm? Then again, it's time to abort mission. It's time to pause and stop the interaction, get away, ask for help. All of these things differ from just simply avoiding an interaction, because being able to say, I'm going to hit the pause button, but I'm going to return to this, demonstrates positive intent that you will make time and you will follow through. But when someone is harmful, or you're dealing with someone who is a victim of harmful behaviors in their lives, they may at that moment feel physically threatened and emotionally threatened by you, even though you don't intend it, because their perception of a safe and soothing world has been shattered, and possibly shattered many times. And that's where it's important to say, I'm doing unintended harm, I'm going to hit the pause button here. But someone has to exercise reason in those situations. And we're hoping that you feel growing confidence in being able to be the person to be the diplomat. In the absence of resolution.
Yeah, I'd like to chime in a little, Donna. I'm sorry, I was muted. I was trying to talk in the last slide.
Gotcha. Here we go.
An excellent way to practice this, because when you're wanting to engage with someone, you're being open-hearted and open to them. When the conversation, the interaction turns hostile in that you need to protect yourself, most people are very, very slow to make that transition. And practicing it helps enormously. And one of the best places I have found in my Ombuds career, my psychotherapy career, is taking a self-defense course. Because it's not just about the physical self-defense, they will teach you that mental switch. When there's something that triggers that this is not safe, how to quickly switch into self-protection mode. It does require practice. So that's all I need to say. Thanks, Donna.
Thank you very much. And I agree with that wholeheartedly. I study AIKIDO. So I just want to cheer that suggestion. That studying AIKIDO has done a world of improvement for me, has created a world of improvement for me in being able to negotiate difficult situations and understand how to diffuse tension. But in the absence of resolution, we wanted to offer you a new idea about the role of apology and the role of closure. Our general suggestion is meet that moment with awareness, observe details, do your best to do no harm, plant a seed that may bear fruit in the future, set a boundary for what's acceptable and self-respect, ask for help and look at resources. But beyond that, what about apologizing? I'm gonna hand it to my partner, Kirsi.
So, apologizing is an interesting thing. We rely heavily on apologies in our culture, and it's become so rote that there's often situations where it's meaningless. So when someone apologizes to you or to me, in this culture in the United States, we have a habit of saying, oh, that's okay. And what that does is it minimizes the harm that was done, as well as the apology, frankly. So Dr. Harriet Lerner recommends that you do this instead. When someone apologizes to you, you simply say, thank you for the apology. I appreciate it. Nothing more. She also does not recommend in that moment correcting people that they should have done something better. Simply accepting the apology. If you have criticism of that person to give, another occasion is going to be a better one to do it, not in what Brene Brown calls the apology corner, right? The other thing to note is that just because someone apologizes to you, it does not mean the relationship will be restored to what it was. There are harms that a simple apology really doesn't fix. And it is okay when someone tries to apologize for something that apologies don't fix, to basically say that. So here's an example of some language. If you see the problem, so if someone apologizes to say, I'm sorry, I didn't realize you were so sensitive about that. Here's a good response. If you see the problem as my reaction and not what you said, I'm afraid I can't accept your apology. And if they insist that saying something like, oh, it was no big deal, you can respond with, apparently we see this differently. And another note that I want to make is that some people do not offer verbal apologies. They perform apologies. My husband's one of those people. So, you know, if he does something, the next thing I know, he's packed my lunch, you know. So people can perform apologies, and that is perfectly okay. It does not have to be verbal. This is a very interesting concept that I really like from Dr. Lerner. We have this concept in our culture that forgiveness is essential, that we have to forgive in order to be whole people, in order to heal. And I don't agree with it, neither does she. So if you're interested in looking at this a little further, I highly recommend her book, which was in the chats earlier. It's Why Won't You Apologize? So the understanding in our culture is that you're not going to get over lingering anger and resentment unless you apologize. So what Dr. Lerner says, and what is absolutely my experience, is that there are many paths to healing. And you can understand the situation, you can love the person, you can wish them well. And that's not the same as forgiveness necessarily. You can let go. It doesn't need to embitterness, as opposed to forgiving what they did. Another concept that's very helpful from Dr. Lerner is degrees of a forgiveness. This also comes out of the work of Dr. Janice Abrams Spring, who is a therapist that deals with infidelity in couples. You can decide that you can forgive part of what someone did and not the entire piece. That is perfectly acceptable. I did a webinar on Dr. Lerner's book, Why Won't You Apologize? If you want to watch that, it's a short way of getting introduced to this topic. So here's what Dr. Janice Spring says. Forgiveness is not a cheap gift. Rushing to a premature and superficial peace can have its own costs. And personally, what I have noticed in the work environment is that this is exactly what happens when we're talking about racism. Someone commits a racist act, they apologize, and they expect the forgiveness to come automatically. And I don't think that that helps anyone, because it allows it makes, how should I say this? It makes the victim of the aggression do the work of forgiving, as opposed to the party who was aggressing do the work of rethinking, figuring out how not to do it again, making amends. I hope I'm making sense here. Dr. Lerner says, I use the word forgiveness sparingly and only when it is earned through a process of open-hearted listening. In the absence of a sincere apology, or some way a person might show me that they are truly sorry and will not repeat the injury, I have no idea what it means to forgive a harmful or hurtful incident, though I know what it means to love that person anyway and wish them well. I think this is very important in this culture on the topic of racism, that we cannot just minimize the harm that is caused to people. Donna, do we have time to do a chat, or should we try to close?
I would love a chat. Let's do it. Ready?
Okay. I'm really curious, and I'm glad we have time for this, because I'm really curious about this. Just give me a Y or N, does the concept of not unilaterally forgiving others make you comfortable, and why? So why or and then the why. Does the concept of not unilaterally forgiving others make you uncomfortable, and why? Everyone must be thinking. Yes, because humans don't always learn. No, it gives me permission to honor my true feelings. It does make me uncomfortable. I hate conflict and want to move on quickly, so say sorry is what I do. Yes, when you've said, what you've said shows how complex these interactions and exchanges are and the harm that is often involved. Yes, forgiveness must be genuine and complete. No, because cheap grace and forgiveness isn't meaningful. Yes, it makes me uneasy that I am holding on to resentment. No, I appreciate and understand your advice. No, some transgressions are harder to forgive. Uncomfortable because I don't know how to have that conversation. Yes, because not all acts can be forgiven. And forgiving can happen, but you shouldn't necessarily forget. Yes, some things cannot be forgiven and forgotten. No, I don't owe people who have done nothing to the right the wrong. Apologies are rarely as simple as I'm sorry that I harmed you. Yeah. So I recognize that this is uncomfortable for some folks as a concept. I personally do land an agreement with Dr. Lerner. But I want to address one comment, which was, I don't want to hold on to resentment. You can let go and move on. You can love the person. You can wish them well. You don't have to forgive them, and you don't have to hold on to the resentment. There are lots of ways to get to not holding on to the resentment besides forgiveness. Okay.
The whole point of our workshop is using listening to increase your understanding of a situation, not necessarily give you a prescripted response as to how you should solve a situation, but how to really listen so that your understanding increases. I wanted to offer this thought. In truth, we must be willing to expect of ourselves the same agility, investment, and magnitude of transformation we expect of and observe in our students. So if we allow ourselves perpetual learning, it means listening is one of those underdeveloped skills where most of us can probably put an awful lot of juiciness and intention. So we'd like to.
Oops, Donna, you're muted. Thank you. Oops, you're muted again.
Okay.
We have some issues with this platform, folks. We've figured out most of them, but it self-selects things that we haven't selected.
Our next conversation, part 4 of 6, is about moving into questioning with courage. How to formulate questions after you've done some very, very deep listening. And that will be next Wednesday, July 22nd at 12 noon. We'd like to move to Q&A. Thank you very much for your patience. Thank you for your attentiveness. We're going to bounce to the chat and address things that we may have glossed over. I will stop sharing my screen.
Okay, and I know there was a question earlier, and Carrie, if you can help me find it, or if you find it, feel free to read it out loud. I'm trying to go back.
The one that Jennifer Mulligan asked before is
Yes.
trying to identify underlying emotions in contradiction to suspending assumptions and evaluations.
So Jennifer, do you feel like you got some more sort of hints about that with the rest of our conversation, or are you still wanting a response to that? So you want us to comment?
I would love to chime in on that.
Go ahead.
I feel that prejudgment is very much about reaching a conclusion before the situation has fully revealed itself. So in saying try to suspend the need to prejudge, it means try not to conclude where that argument or where that disagreement should end. Mm-hmm. Now, if I'm dealing with a racist interaction and I'm trying to say, I'm trying to convert this person to be a non-racist, or I'm trying to get them to understand where their microaggression was harmful. I have learned to suspend judgment and to back up and say, what in this person's value system has got them to the place where they are willing to aggress upon me? So I'm listening more for their values rather than their politics. I'm listening more for where there may be a damaging event in their past. I'm waiting to see if there is some impact to cognition. I'm listening carefully rather than just saying, this person is racist and I'm done with them.
Mm-hmm.
So that's what I mean by saying suspend the need to judge and pre-conclude. Stay in investigation mode and research mode if possible. It might make it a teachable moment. I have found that by remaining in listening mode, I can usually keep a conversation going rather than have it escalate into a series of insults and hostilities.
Yeah, I would like to add that I'm a brain science geek, and our brains do not operate in a logical fashion. We create errors and biases in our brains in all sorts of ways all the time about all topics. And I actually did a webinar on that yesterday, and looking at Dr. Daniel Kahneman's work in a little more detail. He identified 48 different ways in which we distort things. And so those are ways in which we prejudge, and all kinds of ways in which we prejudge before we really even hear the information. We're not even listening anymore. We've jumped to the conclusions. And so it does help when you're listening for emotion, because you're focusing on how that other person is feeling. It helps get you out of that analytical mode where you're trying to come up with why they're wrong. I find it's a different function.
And Ms. Milligan, that was a wonderful question. Thank you very much.
Yes.
You addressed it.
You.
Other questions?
I haven't seen any questions, so to speak, but a lot of great comments have scrolled through while you've been talking. Christine, just to highlight a couple, says, "Tell me more" is extremely effective. She agrees that would be an effective way to get to the heart of what people are talking to explore it more, to meet it with more curiosity. Just to highlight a few others, Laura said, she found inspiration for waiting attentively from Lao Tzu and some of the, the writings of Lao Tzu.
Yeah, The Art of War.
Yeah. And Sharon Adams says, it's interesting to listen for emotion in the voice versus the content of the speech. Kind of a unique idea to listen to the voice versus the content.
Yeah. Yeah. And that technique of listening for emotion is something that therapists learn when they go through their schooling, because as human beings, what comes out of our mouth is often incongruent to what's actually going on in our heart. And that term incongruous was something that, was sort of hammered into me in grad school. But in other words, what we say, how we feel, is not how we're feeling. And you can, in observing someone's body language, tone of voice, you can see there's a disconnect. And when you're listening for when you're observing for the feeling, it gets you in a very different place too.
Hopefully it does. I can remember early in learning my activist work and how to be an advocate for others, listening to other people's emotions would be a very draining experience. I would feel depleted very quickly, catch myself yawning, physically getting tired. And so I can't emphasize enough that it really is about building stamina slowly. It's about doing your very best, but not slapping yourself on the wrist to force yourself forward. If you can pace it. That's a wonderful way to build your stamina. Honestly, not everyone has that luxury, and it is a luxury to be able to hit the pause button. There are many situations, especially for people of color in predominantly white environments, where there's a relentlessness to what they experience. And the general sense of fatigue, the exhaustion from it, having to navigate a sense of isolation and being ostracized, it wears on people. So listening, and rather than focusing on being the problem solver, but being a very, very sincere listener, can go an awfully long way in combating racism. And it also provides someone else a sense of belonging. We're going to continue to talk about that more next week.
Great questions, everyone. I really love how you've engaged with the material today, and appreciate you probing further and, helping us to talk a little bit more in depth about various pieces. Of course, in a short webinar, it's impossible for us to include everything. And so we appreciate when you signal to us some areas that you want a little more depth in, so that we can share that.
We wish you a wonderful day. Carrie, thank you for helping us.
Yes.
Thank you.
And everyone, please look for a follow-up email with additional resources and handouts for you. Have a beautiful rest of the day, and we'll see you next Wednesday. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.